Hello and welcome. I am Ramin Siddiqui, Modern Diplomacy, and today we are diving deep into a timely yet critical conversation about the evolving security discourse in South Asia. From shifting power dynamics to strategic deterrence and the role of nationalist narratives, this region currently sits at the heart of the world's most pressing security challenges. I have the honor of being joined with one of the leading voices in South Asia, Michael Kugelman. He is the director of the South Asian Institute at Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. His insightful analysis on foreign policy, security, and regional politics has shaped academic and policy discourse across the world. So, thank you so much for joining us today. I would start with the bigger picture first. I've got some very interesting questions for you, but as a lighter question to break the ice, I want to start with a bigger picture. So you've observed South Asia with a critical and a sharp lens for years. So how do you describe the notable shifts happening in the region that are evolving the security dynamics today, like recently?
Yeah, it's a great question, and not necessarily a simple one. The region for the better part of the last two decades, and I've seen a lot. Certainly, a lot has changed. A lot has not changed. I think that's important to point out. There's been a fair amount of consistency in trend. One thing that I would single out is, when you look at the security dynamics, when you look at the regional geopolitics of South Asia. The fact that this is a region that is not very well connected and integrated is very significant, certainly for economic reasons, but also for security reasons. We talk so much about the India-Pakistan relationship and the challenges there, but this is a region where you have many countries that simply struggle to get along, and not just India and Pakistan, but also Pakistan and Afghanistan. India and some of its smaller neighbors have had a series of disagreements and disputes, and also the borders of the region. There are so many borders that are fraught for whatever reason, whether because they're disputed or because of cross-border violence, or because of other types of volatilities. So for me, that's something that has been concerning for quite some time and continues to be concerning now. And I would just say this, that for the last 4 years, until the recent India-Pakistan conflict, the LOC, the line of control, was arguably one of the more stable borders in the
Yeah,
region in the sense that there was a truce that had been in place for about 4 years.
yeah.
But then, as we've seen, not surprisingly, because this is how these things work, once again now the LOC is extremely tense
Volatile, yeah.
and particularly significant given that you've got two nuclear states there.
Mhm. Okay, so we've seen nationalism surging in the region across a few years now. So, in your opinion, how does the rise of populist or nationalist politics in South Asia disrupt the traditional logic of nuclear deterrence between India and Pakistan? Has it made escalation more likely or has it made it less predictable?
Well, I think both, but I think certainly one could argue, indeed, it has increased the risks of escalation. I mean, you look at the case study of India. I
Mm.
think that the current Indian government has made the conclusion that a hard line on Pakistan is politically advantageous in the sense that there's a view that, across the board, not necessarily across the board, but across much of the public in India, there is support for this idea of taking a hard line or a harder line that had been the case in previous years. And so we saw that in 2019, when India and Pakistan were facing a crisis somewhat similar to the one that came in 2025, only of course, the earlier one was less serious. Um, you had the Indian government at a point of time close to elections, and I think that one could argue that the Indian decision to take the steps that it did, such as launching airstrikes in Pakistan beyond Pakistan-administered Kashmir for the first time since 1971, was in some ways driven by considerations about politics, and that comes to the issue of populism. So I think this sense of populist figures like Modi, who I think we could describe as a populist, he's also a nationalist,
Yeah.
but
Both.
also a populist, view this, really look at the Pakistan issue from this lens of politics. I mean, that's not the only reason why India has taken this type of position against Pakistan, but I do think it's certainly a part of it. And obviously that, has an impact on how the wider public looks at the broader state of play. In terms of predictability, unpredictability, yes. I mean, I think this is a factor as well that uh, well, actually, I probably would hesitate. I think that the best way to answer this question is that escalation risks go up when you have entrenched populism, just because it's more likely that you're going to have leaders more inclined, more willing to take a hard line. In this case, India taking a harder line on Pakistan, knowing that that would sort of reflect the grievances and it would resonate with the sentiment of the broad public. And this is what populists try to do. They try to
Yeah.
tap into that type of sentiment.
Yeah. So my next question is just exactly what you mentioned right now, that populist leaders reflect broader sentiments, public sentiments in terms of, taking hard lines on countries, rivals, all of that. So in a way, you just answered that question, but I'll still ask you, how does the domestic political agenda in both India and Pakistan weaponize cross-border conflict for domestic political gains? How do you think that takes place? Because it does.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting in that we've heard for some years that India believes that Pakistan is not a problem and that it is something that could be managed, and that the main focus should be on the growing strategic challenge posed by China and so on. Um, and that when you have these nationalist TV anchors
Yeah.
and political figures railing against Pakistan, that it's all
Yeah.
performative. And that might be true to an extent, but even if it's performative, that still has an impact on, how the broader public looks at and perceives Pakistan, and it certainly sets expectations as well. And I think this gets to the most recent crisis, though it also applies to the 2019 crisis. Um, when you have this horrific attack, the one that triggered the recent
Yes.
conflict, the attack in Pahalgam, one of the worst terrorist attacks in Indian-administered Kashmir for quite some time,
Yeah.
given the way much of the public feels about Pakistan, believing that Pakistan must have had some type of connection to that attack, even though to this point India has not provided any evidence publicly linking
Yeah.
Pakistan to the attack,
To the
there's
attack.
going to be significant amounts of pressure from the public on the government in India. And so that's why, you know, it was very clear that India was going to respond with force and with muscular levels of force along the lines of what we had not seen for quite some time. Because the nature of the terrorist attack, but also because of this soaring pressure from the Indian public. Unlike in 2019, it was not an election year. There weren't elections to be thinking about, so the immediate political angle wasn't there. But this is essentially a very strong majority view among the population that India had to do something. It had to
Yeah.
hit back
It had to have a
against
rebuttal
Pakistan.
against the attack or the retaliation.
Exactly.
Yeah. So do you think
And
jingoistic journalism
oh,
plays a role in this? Hyping people up,
jingoistic journalism?
yeah, like hyping people up and stoking. We are not discussing here whether the facts that they produce on their media are correct or not. That's a separate discussion. But hyping people up like that, like hypersensationalism through their news, and especially when there's a crisis going on, that impacts.
Right. I mean, it certainly affects public thinking for sure. Now, in the India case, the ones that get attention are the English language TV networks, those that are particularly nationalistic. These are, this plays well on social media, and within a certain subset of Indian society, this certainly resonates. But these are the English language channels, and that suggests that a significant number of people in India would not be consuming that type of media. But if you look at this more broadly across the entire Indian media sphere, where indeed you do have a significant amount of jingoistic media, which always surges during these crises and conflicts,
Yes,
such as the one with Pakistan, I think it can be very dangerous
it
because,
is.
what we've seen in recent years is that the jingoism also encourages and at times propagates disinformation.
Yes,
And that in of itself is very dangerous. To me, it seems like on the Indian side, so much of the jingoistic media content was accompanied by disinformation. I mean, oftentimes it was
absolutely.
synonymous.
Absolutely. It
Very
becomes
dangerous.
anonymous. Yeah. Yep. You're right on that. So now I want to talk about a little bit on the nuclear doctrines. So do you think that nuclear doctrines still have a place in the age of cyber warfare, hybrid threats, and disinformation campaigns? Or are we preparing for the wrong kind of war?
I mean, I think that it's essential for each country. Well, I shouldn't say just India and Pakistan, any
Mhm.
country to take stock of the power and influence of disinformation. Now, of course, we know that governments themselves participate in some of these new forms of warfare, so to speak, like cyber war. I mean, this is something that a number of states are carrying out on a regular basis. Um, and so, in that sense, one should never be complacent about the need to be maintaining preparedness for the risk of a nuclear exchange when it comes to the case of India and Pakistan. Yeah, that's very clear. And if anything, what we've seen over nearly a decade shows that both Pakistan and India are willing to um, comfortably use increasing amounts of conventional force below the nuclear threshold. Even though it's below the nuclear threshold, the more that you use, the higher up the escalation ladder you get, and the higher you get up, you get closer to bumping up against the ceiling, so to speak. So
Yeah.
the nuclear escalation risks are absolutely, those are going to remain paramount. And despite the emergence of these new developments that you've listed, disinformation campaigns and cyber warfare, that doesn't supplant the importance of um, nuclear doctrines, nuclear escalation risk. But I think they all have to be looked at in the same broader context, right? Because you have two nuclear states that have fought multiple wars in the past, and in their nuclear eras, they've been willing to use conventional force, which raises
Yes.
the risk of escalations
Of
when
escalation.
tensions get particularly high. Yeah, but um, disinformation is something that inflames emotions and it can deepen tensions. So in
Mm.
that sense, one could argue, to put it very simply, that cyber warfare, disinformation can deepen tensions between two countries that are nuclear and further raise the risk of nuclear escalation.
Yeah. So if you talk about China's growing influence in South Asia, military and economic, what do you think? Does it recalibrate South Asia's security dynamics, knowing that it has a lot of power, economic and military, especially keeping in mind that Pakistan is aligned with CPEC and India is aligned with the Quad Alliance?
Yeah, it's interesting that in recent months there's been a lot of talk about how this so-called ironclad alliance between Pakistan and China has faced challenges because of China's concerns about security risks to its
Mm.
investments and other assets in Pakistan. And that's true, but I think we were reminded with this recent India-Pakistan conflict just how special and strong the China-Pakistan alliance continues to be, right? The fact that Pakistan for the first time was using Chinese-made jets against India. First time that's happened in combat. And so, I think that's an indication of where things could go. And particularly if you look at Pakistan's other defense partners, it has the U.S., it has Saudi Arabia, it has Turkey, but China is the only country that's in a position to provide the types of weapons that can be useful in a big way for Pakistan in its conflicts against India. And I would argue that we've seen the U.S. Um, maintain this position and really double down on this position of not wanting Pakistan to use American-made weaponry against India. The Trump administration set aside almost $400 million earlier this year
Yeah.
for this monitoring program to do just that, to make sure that U.S.-made jets were being used by Pakistan for counterterrorism
Mm.
operations, not operations against India. So
Against
that
India.
suggests that China's importance, yeah, China's importance will rise even more in terms of what Pakistan can get from China in terms of the arms support it can provide. Turkey is providing, Turkish-made drones were used by Pakistan in the last conflict, but China provides jets, it provides air defense
Yeah.
systems, it provides
So
radars.
a lot
There's so much
stronger
there.
military partners compared to Turkey, and a lot more reliable
Yes, oh,
also, if I may
absolutely.
say that.
Yeah. And you look at China's influence more broadly across the region. It's not, its military influence is not nearly as deep elsewhere in the region as it is in Pakistan, but it is a key arms supplier to several other countries in the region, including Bangladesh.
Yeah.
And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Now, China's economic influence, indeed, that's a bit different. That's more diffuse. It's more region-wide through CPEC. But I would argue that we shouldn't overstate this. Yes, China is providing a lot of infrastructure investments across the region through the BRI. But some of that has slowed down. I think that for a number of reasons, security concerns in Pakistan, economic issues across the region, the BRI seems to have lost some momentum. So Chinese
Yeah.
economic influence will remain paramount in the region. But I don't necessarily think we should overstate it in terms of how it recalibrates South Asia's security dynamics. I think that this has been a constant for quite some time. I don't think we should be talking about recalibration. We should just be talking about consistency, that for quite some time, China has been developing a deeper economic footprint and a more robust military influence in the region, with military mainly Pakistan, but Bangladesh to an extent as well. And this is really just something consistent that's been playing out for some time.
So we were talking about nationalism in the broader perspective of it shaping the public sentiment. Do you think that it also has the potential, or maybe it does in actuality, influence decisions, political decisions during crises, especially when it comes to the risk of nuclear escalation or a nuclear retaliation?
Well, I mean, again, as we were discussing before, populist nationalist governments, um, in some ways, like democratic governments, and populist nationalist governments can be democratic. Oftentimes, they're not, but I think it's a similar dynamic. They feel a need to respond to grievances. They feel a need to tap into grievances that are held across society, and I think we were talking about India earlier, but I think both India and Pakistan, during the recent conflict, there was a significant level of anger harbored by each public toward the other country. And so, in that sense, there is significant amounts of pressure for both countries to hit out and hit out hard. Again, that's not the only reason why we saw such a rapid escalation in this recent India-Pakistan conflict. I mean, it
Yeah,
also came down to, actual military operations and the fact that India
absolutely.
launched these extremely uh, ambitious set of airstrikes, and Pakistan
Yeah.
had to respond. It didn't want to look weak, and it had the capacity to respond. But the public sentiment is very important for these types of populist nationalist governments. The Pakistani government is not populist, it's not nationalistic. That's not, but so I think this might apply more to the India
Indian
case. But
side, yeah.
still, there's here, I mean, Pakistan's government has struggled with issues of popularity or lack
Mhm.
thereof. And I think for both the civilian and the military leadership in Pakistan, it was important to be receptive to public anger and act on that through its responses so as not to risk completely losing the public, so to
Absolutely.
speak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you think that given that nationalism is rising and populism and all of that, is there any concept of strategic stability left in South Asia?
Well, th there is in the sense that the nuclear deterrent is actually alive and well, and it may seem hard to believe to be talking along those lines, given that everyone is discussing how the nuclear deterrent was tested
Yeah,
in the last conflict, and that it seems that each country is just very comfortable using force
exactly.
against the other. So it may seem like, well, maybe the deterrence being eroded,
Mm.
um, impelled in part by that sense of having to capitalize on public sentiment to
Yeah,
fulfill, populist characteristics, so to speak. But neither. I mean, each country, each government in the last conflict indicated that they had no intent of a wider, like all-out war.
yeah,
And I think that's true. Neither side wanted an all-out war. And of course, with the jingoistic media and the hardliners on both sides, certainly there's going to be some members of the public, some influencers, some commentators that are really pushing for all-out war and destroy the other country and all of that. That does not at all reflect government positions on either side. And I think that each side does still respect the nuclear deterrent. And in some ways, if you look at how each country acted in this recent conflict, it was meant, I think, to really reflect continued respect for the deterrent. The fact that India responded with a set of airstrikes, it did it very quickly, it wanted to do it quickly before things could get to a point where we'd have to worry about um, Pakistan wanting to respond in ways that could lead to something worse, resulting
yeah,
in escalation risks. And for all the talk from the Trump administration about the U.S. really basically getting the two sides to stop fighting and agreeing to the ceasefire, India and Pakistan had reached a point where they were ready to declare victory and
yeah,
and step off. They negotiated their own ceasefire. It wasn't the
yeah,
Trump administration that was
yeah.
mediating it. And I think that's a reflection, again, of how they both recognize that each country is nuclear and they don't want to do anything beyond, an initial point where they could say they achieved tactical objectives, which both sides, I think, could say that. So I think that, we've been having a conversation that taps into some pretty, depressing and ominous issues like nuclear
Mm.
escalation risk. But I would actually argue that at the end of the day, the nuclear deterrent remains alive and well. It has been tested in ways that it has not before, including particularly in this latest conflict,
Yeah.
probably tested in ways that it hasn't been since the massive military buildup on the border in 2001, 2002. But it's been tested, but even if it's being tested, doesn't mean it's destined to fail the test, so to speak. I think each side has reinforced its commitment to the nuclear deterrent.
But then my question here is that even if it's all well by the end, whenever it ends after a week or 2 months or so, don't you think like not having the no first strike, we used to hear about the no first strike doctrine. I'm not sure if it's there anymore. But don't you think the fact that a nuclear rival can strike erodes the sovereignty of the other rival, the other country, the fact that it happened, because it was so shocking for the public to even accept that it has already happened, because we all hear in the media that India might do something, Pakistan might do something, but it actually happened and people have suffered on the ground, like in the cities where the attack happened, the airstrikes happened. So don't you think like fundamentally, if you look at from that lens, it does erode the sovereignty of the other state and it puts the whole region in jeopardy and in a state of instability, for lack of a better word.
Well, right. I mean, the escalation dynamics in this last conflict clearly reflected a violation of sovereignty in the purest sense. India's airstrikes, which it depicted as targeting not state targets, but terrorist
Yeah,
targets, but still, I mean, that would be viewed as Pakistan as a clear violation of its sovereignty and territorial integrity. And then Pakistan, responding, and the fact that each country was sending drones and missiles into the other's territory. I mean, of course, when it comes to conflict, international these normative ideals around respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, they go out the door. That's just the way these things work.
yeah,
But coming to the no first use policy, indeed, I mean, so far as I know, this continues to be Pakistan's policy that it will not sign on to a no first
absolutely.
use policy, whereas
Yeah,
India has. Um, I really see that. I really see that from a stability lens, more than anything else, obviously. But yeah, I mean, I think that these international principles that you lay out, I mean, those certainly apply as well. But I don't think you necessarily need to get to that worst case scenario point where you're thinking about the possible implications of Pakistan not using a no first use policy and what that could mean for its choice to use nuclear weapons in a particular contingency. You don't have to go out that far to that absolute worst case nightmare scenario. You could just look at what's happened in this recent conflict, and even in 2016, right, which was, one of the earlier cases where India responded to a terrorist attack with
Yeah,
a retaliation on Pakistani soil.
yeah,
Surgical strikes was very
yeah.
brief. Sent some commandos across the LOC. They came right back. That would appear to be it could be would be viewed by Pakistan as a violation of territorial integrity as well. So this is just, I think, that these principles become casualties of relationships that can be very hostile and fraught.
Okay, so on the hopeful side, now my question is that do you think like after everything that has happened, do we have any real space left for confidence building measures or security dialogue between the two rivals, or has that door been slammed shut?
Well, I mean, according to the U.S. Secretary of State, each side agreed to talks in a neutral site. I find that hard to believe. I can't imagine India would be committed to that. I
Yeah,
think that it's important and good that the DGMO hotline remains open. This is, of course, a hotline that top officials, military officials from both countries use, and this has always remained open, even during wars, and
absolutely. Yeah,
it was used in the recent conflict. So long as they continue to talk. I think that will help ensure that this fragile ceasefire remains in place. Um, but beyond that, yes, I think that the two sides just don't line up when it comes to the issue of dialogue. And India, for all India has said about no talks with terror, not interested in talks with Pakistan, Modi's speech after the ceasefire, he said that we would be willing to talk, but about issues that Pakistan would not want to talk about, that being the issue of terrorism, of Pakistan-sponsored terrorism, as India
yeah,
describes it, and
yeah.
also, as India describes it, POK, Pakistan-administered
That's also
Kashmir.
agreed with that.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah, it's right. That India's term for Pakistan-administered Kashmir, Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, and so of course Pakistan wants to talk about India-administered Kashmir. Basically has concluded that that's settled since Article 370 was
yeah,
revoked almost 5 years ago, almost 6 years ago. That's not up for discussion. Pakistan, of course, has said that Pakistan administered Kashmir is not up for discussion. So what does that
yeah,
leave you? And I think this then gets to dynamics of leadership. We know that there have been periods where the two sides have had comprehensive dialogue. There have been some pretty significant steps taken toward a peace process. One of the most recent ones was Musharraf and Manmohan Singh. Of
yeah.
course, it didn't last. Um, so I just don't think that Modi is someone that wants to take that step. I think Modi was testing the waters when
Hmm.
very early in his first term he traveled to Pakistan to meet
Yeah,
with Nawaz Sharif, the prime
yeah.
minister at that point. There was then a terrorist attack in India just a few weeks later,
Few weeks
and
later,
I think
yeah. And then it
and
major
that
made relationship
basically
fraught again.
yeah, exactly. And I think that's why people would say, oh, can't Modi do one of these Nixon goes to China type things, where he uses his strong political clout to do something that might seem politically unpopular and reach out to Pakistan. But ever since what happened after his trip to Pakistan, I think it's sort of a case of once bitten, twice shy. He's just not willing to go there. And the Pakistani side, of course, has publicly been calling for talk, and one of
Yeah,
the big
we're very open for dialogue. Always, Pakistani side has always been very open
well,
to dialogue. Yeah, but
Well, yes, right. I mean, well, that's the publicly stated position, indeed. But I think that even Pakistan would set certain conditions, like Kashmir, like
yeah,
a willingness to discuss, on India's side to discuss Kashmir and make compromises and concessions on Kashmir, which
yeah,
India is not willing to make. And the final point on this is that it seems like there's always some type of spoiler act that happens. There's always like a terrorist attack or something like that breaks up any momentum you have toward talks. And India's perspective, of course, is that those spoiler acts are sponsored by Pakistan. Whether
yeah.
that's true or not, the bottom line is that it's been very difficult to sustain these moments when it looks like things might finally be moving toward a point where you'll have a sustained dialogue.
But do you think it can the peace talks or the ceasefire can happen without a mediator, without another global power jumping in and saying, "Okay, enough, just it's time for a truce"? Do you think that can happen? Because we've discussed a very long list of issues that Pakistan does not want to talk about and India doesn't want to talk about, and they don't want to sit at a table until both of their respective issues are being discussed. Then don't you think it's a very difficult situation then, especially
Yeah, you're
without a
right. I mean,
mediator?
exactly. I mean, I think a third party mediator in principle could be very helpful, but India, of course, has tended to reject the idea of preemptive third-party mediation. It is
Yeah,
receptive, well, it's sensitive to it. It's receptive to mediate third-party mediation during actual crises and conflicts.
yeah,
But when it comes to the idea of third-party mediation to bring the two sides together, it's tended to resist that because it fears that everything would come back to Kashmir. Though I think we
yeah,
could look at the LOC truce that we mentioned at the beginning of our conversation as an interesting case study. That was a truce. I mean, it basically, there was not a crisis or a conflict at the time,
mhm,
but there was growing levels of cross-border violence, tensions growing between the two. And the UAE, among, I think, a few countries, helped negotiate or helped broker
yeah.
that truce
That
between India and
agreement, yeah.
Pakistan.
It was the
But that
UAE,
was
yeah,
toward a very
yeah,
specific end. It wasn't just to try to get the two sides to agree to talk about a wide variety of issues. It was toward a very specific objective. So
mhm.
that might mean that there's limits to what India would be receptive to in terms of third-party mediation.
So I just mentioned the global powers right now. Do you think when they're watching a nuclear escalation like this in South Asia, they are maybe recalibrating their strategies? They're watching from the sidelines, or are they subtly pulling the strings in this whole act?
I mean, honestly, I think that the major powers, U.S., Russia, China, any other one you'd want to identify, they actually have a similar view on these issues. I mean, they don't want things to get to a point where you have to worry about nuclear escalation risk, and that's
Yeah.
especially a significant concern for China and Russia to an extent because of geographic proximity. The U.S. is a
Yes.
bit further removed geographically. So, not a surprise, even though India was upset about this during the recent conflict, those three rivals, or well, the US and its Chinese and Russian rivals were all basically singing the same tune, so to speak. They were all calling for de-escalation. They all welcomed mediation. They all wanted the conflict to end sooner rather than later so that it wouldn't get to the nuclear level. Um,
Yeah.
I don't know if, and the U.S. clearly was willing to mediate. I don't think China and Russia have the status, so to speak, to mediate.
Mhm.
They don't have the good ties with both India and
Yeah.
Pakistan that the U.S. does. Though I think honestly, some of the Gulf states, the Arab Gulf states in particular, are best placed to play those mediating roles. They're not
Roles.
major powers, but they are nations with significant clout
Yeah.
and influence. But yeah, so I think yes. I mean, so these major powers have been watching from the sidelines. The U.S. was trying to do more than pull strings. It was mediating. It was
Mhm.
pushing the two sides to negotiate a ceasefire. But I think at the end of the day, they just hope that the things will not get to the point between these two countries where you have to worry about nuclear escalation risks.
But do you think that's only because of them wishing for the world peace, or because they have their vested interest here in this region, which is huge? The geopolitical, geoeconomical interest in this region, in both of the nuclear rivals.
Yeah, well, I mean, stability is the major concern for sure, as it would be with any country. But I think, there's also could be like more specific interests at play. I mean, certainly China, it's investing heavily in Pakistan. It's got a lot of assets there. It
Yeah.
sees Pakistan geographically as important from the perspective of BRI and accessing markets and via Gwadar or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
So the last thing it would want is for Pakistan to be embroiled in a conflict, much less a nuclear conflict. Um, and China, even despite its rivalry with India, I mean, it's always looking for opportunities to engage commercially. It's looking to ramp up investment in India. There'd been a bit of progress toward that front as tensions had eased a bit between India and China in recent months. Um, yeah, I think Russia has a close relationship with India, but it needs friends. It fears that Europe is trying to isolate it, NATO's
Yeah.
trying to isolate it, and it looks to Pakistan as a potential new friend.
Yeah.
And the U.S., ultimately stability is going to be its main concern, but it does have interests, key interests with both India and Pakistan that certainly would be imperiled if the two countries are dragged into a war.
So that brings me to my last question, which is a little philosophical, as well as it's just you'll enjoy answering it. So the question is that if the world is becoming more inward looking and less invested in peace in South Asia, who fills the vacuum and with what consequences?
Um, well, Yeah, it's a tough call. I mean, I think honestly that the region is going to be on its own, but I would argue that there are a number of states that remain invested in the region in South Asia. And here I think over the long term we have to look at some of the countries I mentioned before, the Arab Gulf states, which have leverage over India and Pakistan because they provide significant amounts of energy exports and other goods. And as I mentioned with the UAE example, there's a case study of mediation. So I do think that there will be efforts. It may not happen tomorrow, but um, there will be efforts on the part of some countries to try to do what they can to, you know, suggest incentives for India and Pakistan to ensure that things don't get completely out of control.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of our conversation. Is there anything that you'd like to add or share your views on anything? Because I'm done with my questions here. Do
No,
you
that
want to
was
share?
all. I appreciate the
Yeah,
opportunity
yeah.
to talk with you.
Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed our conversation. It was rich, and I know that our audience will really love it, especially it's hot and burning right now. Everybody is looking for answers, and your insights were really good. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for taking out time for this critical conversation. I enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you. It was great to speak with you, Ramin, and hope to do
Yeah,
it again.
likewise. So do that, do that. Thank you so much, Michael. Have a good day.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Take care. Bye. That's all for now. I hope that you enjoyed our conversation as much as we did. For more thought-provoking stories, insights, expert dialogues, stay tuned to our YouTube channel and visit us at our website, moderndiplomacy.eu. Until next time, take care of yourself and keep making a difference.